My name is Kat Murthy, and I am very proud to be Executive Director of Students for Sensible Drug Policy. We are the largest national network of young people working to end the war on drugs. We were started in 1998, and since then we've had tens of thousands of members and alumni who have worked on every cannabis campaign to date, have worked to decriminalize psychedelics across the country, have worked to increase access to life-saving harm reduction, and have been involved in drug education, drug policy, and harm reduction work around the country. I'm very excited to introduce you to some folks today who are involved with one of our biggest efforts this past year because SSDP is taking the DEA to court to keep psychedelic research legal. And so this coming week, November 12th through 25th, we have a historic hearing at the DEA Administrative Court in Arlington, Virginia, where we will be fighting to keep two scientific research chemicals, DOI and DOC. These are chemicals that most people haven't heard of, but have shown amazing potential in research labs. They've been published over 900 times in academic journals showing all sorts of potential for treating depression and anxiety and pain management and opioid overdose reversal and potentially alcohol addiction and all sorts of serious problems in our society that these drugs are helping scientists understand, particularly when it comes to how serotonin is processed in the brain. And so the DEA has wants to move these drugs to Schedule 1, which would in effect put a major pause on all of this research and really stop our ability to move forward with what could be some really life-saving therapeutic avenues for a lot of people, for tens of thousands of Americans. And so I am so proud today to get to introduce you to some of our SSD peers who have been leading this fight and working very hard to make SSDP the only drug policy organization that is fighting to keep DOI and DOC legal. And so with no further ado, let me introduce you to some of our panelists today. First, we have Dr. Elijah Ullman. Elijah earned his PhD very recently in molecular and systems pharmacology from Emory University. He's the co-founder and chair of Students for Sensible Drug Policy's Science Policy Committee. Elijah first joined SSDP in September 2012 when he was still a sophomore in high school and has been an active member ever since. And in many ways is the reason that SSDP is involved in this fight to keep DOI and DOC legal and has been sort of the ringleader hurting all of us cats in this direction. And so very excited to have Elijah here today. Elijah, thank you for joining.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you.
We also have Dr. Alaina Jaster. Dr. Jaster is a postdoctoral researcher at Wayne State University. She received a PhD in pharmacology and toxicology from Virginia Commonwealth University and has 9 years of experience studying neuroscience and substance use disorders, including 5 of those years spent studying psychedelics and opioids. And her PhD work focused specifically on the potential therapeutic effects of psilocybin and DOI. Alaina, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
I'd also like to introduce all of you to Joe Hennessey. Joe is an MD PhD student at the Medical College of Wisconsin with extensive experience working with psychedelics, including firsthand experience testing DOI and DOC. According to Joe, there is no other compound that exists that possesses DOI's exquisite selectivity for the 5-HT2 subclass of receptors in the brain. So, Joe, thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here.
And then last but not least, we have Tanner Anderson. Tanner is a doctoral candidate at the University of Kentucky Department of Neuroscience. He has over 5 years of experience studying the neurobiology of substance use disorders and psychedelic drugs. And if the DEA were to place DOI and DOC in Schedule 1, his research would come to a screeching halt. So as you can tell, we have just an amazing cohort here today. They're all going to be They've all been leading this fight forward. Several of them are going to be testifying in the DEA administrative court in the next couple weeks. And tell me first, what is the Science Policy Committee? How did it come about within SSDP, and what got all of you involved?
So I can start with that. It was founded in 2020 with Dr. Lindsay Galbo-Toma, while both of us were still in graduate school, and then a few other folks who were studying pharmacology and neuroscience around the country. And we were all involved in, like I said, neuroscience and pharmacology research, and wanted to use that background to advance drug policy efforts, because we're able to really have very different conversations with lawmakers and their offices than folks who don't work on neuroscience and pharmacology. Because we have a really strong understanding of those topics, we just get to talk differently about them. In addition, so we've held a few lobby days in support of some drug policy bills and created some action alerts for NIH and National Science Foundation funding through the years. And then we also tracked the number of STEM members of Congress so that when we would hold lobby days, we could more accurately target those folks that really spoke that same kind of language as us.
Yeah, I think that's such an important aspect of this, right? Because you guys actually do work with a lot of these substances in your labs and you're able to speak a different language. What Tanner, Alaina, Joe, Elijah helped co-found this committee. What got you guys involved?
So I was friends with Eli and Lindsay on the internet and through just like science related Twitter back when it was still what it used to be. And then I went to a conference with Lindsay and talked with her a little bit, but basically just talking about my research online and hooked up with the two co-founders and was asked back when this happened the first time around, hey, do you want to, fight the DEA with us? Do you want to talk about your scientific experience with DOI and like write them, be part of our challenge. And I was like, oh yeah, that sounds great. I'd love to testify. And then we'll talk more about the background of all this in a little bit. But yeah, so I'm still in the fight. I didn't want to give up so easily. And so not only am I super excited to now be a part of this committee and a part of SSDP, but also form some lifelong friendships because of this case. So super cool and super excited to take on everything this coming week.
To take on the DEA.
Yeah.
I guess I'll go next. I got
Yeah.
involved. I'm newer than Elena and Elijah to all this. So I've been involved now for like a little over a year, maybe around a year. And I kind of got into it just through mutual friendships, particularly seeing things that like Elena was posting on like psychedelic spaces and science Twitter and whatnot. And then I just kind of asked to join and be involved because I study DOI and this hits home to me. So I wanted to do everything I could to help.
Yeah, and similarly, I also got involved through science Twitter. There was actually a prominent academic that made a Slack channel for psychedelics researchers, and people posted in there about this case, and it's something I feel very strongly about, and kind of had been wanting to get involved in drug policy for a little while, but didn't have a good avenue to do that through. And then this came up, and I was like, hey, this is the perfect opportunity. So this is really my first time venturing into the policy and advocacy space, but very, very exciting.
Yeah, it has been just a very exciting journey as well for me. Um, just getting to learn so much about this from the scientific perspective, which has been it's been fun for me getting to participate in your committee despite not being a scientist and kind of trying to trying to follow along and understand sometimes what's happening. So let's talk about the case itself. So this is not the first time that the DEA has tried to essentially criminalize DOI and DOC. Um, Tell me about what happened in 2022 up until now.
Yeah. So I think it was around May or April of 2022, the DEA put on the Federal Register, which is basically the record-keeping book of the federal government, that they wanted to put these two compounds on Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act, and that's called a proposed rulemaking. And Kat, like you had said earlier, these are really the two most essential research tool compounds for studying serotonin 2 receptors. And when I say a tool compound, I mean a compound, a drug that you can use to investigate a substance or a target. I don't really say drug because drug is something that people take in my mind. So that would be like aspirin or Tylenol or amphetamine, something like that. But this is a useful, thing that we can use in the lab to study the serotonin receptors.
Yes, I'm glad we're
Like,
talking about that. Let's take a
yeah,
step back. What are DOI and DOC, right? Like how are they used? What's going on? What are we talking about here?
yeah, I'll
I
pass
think
that
most
to
people haven't.
yeah, I'll pass that to the others who work on these.
Yeah, we can kind of go round robin, I guess, and bring up our specific favorite points, maybe. So DOI and DOC are both psychedelics. They are in the phenethylamine family. So that's just a chemistry term for how like they're classified structurally. So they basically look like similarly to amphetamine chemical structure, but they produce some psychedelic effects. They are primarily used in research labs. So I worked with DOI, as was mentioned, and I characterized it both pharmacologically and behaviorally in different rodent models, looking at just basic behaviors, but also stuff related to substance use disorder. So, and I know like Joe mentioned, or in his introduction, it was mentioned they're really specific to the serotonin 2 type receptors, which is really important for characterizing serotonin in the brain. So if anyone wants to build off that, we can kind of go around.
Yeah, so these
I
are
think
actually, it's because they're not scheduled that they've become the de facto tools for understanding serotonin in the brain, right?
partly that.
Yeah,
It's also partly their pharmacological profile. So like I think I didn't want to cut Elena off. I'm sorry, but yeah, they so yeah, they're not scheduled, so that makes them accessible to labs that want to get into studying psychedelic drugs. But part of the reason why DOI is such an important research tool for psychedelic research and even serotonin and neuroscience research at large is because it's one of the few psychedelic drugs that binds to the serotonin 2A and 2C receptors with a very high affinity and more than other receptors in the brain that psilocybin and LSD and these other recreational psychedelic drugs do hit. So people don't realize this is that other psychedelics that maybe the audience has heard of, like LSD and psilocybin and DMT, they're actually a little promiscuous in their binding pharmacology to various receptors in the brain, whether it's serotonin receptors or even some non-serotonin receptors. But DOI really only hits these two serotonin receptors really hard. And that makes it like a perfect tool for studying these receptors specifically, whereas other psychedelic drugs can be a little muddy and messy to pin down exactly what receptor is causing what effects to neurons in the brain.
Yeah, and for the non-pharmacologists here, affinity is the pharmacology term for how tightly something binds to a protein. It really is the concentration at which it comes off of that target. So how tightly it interacts, how that key going into the lock.
Right, and we're talking about this from very scientific terms, and that's not just because you're all scientists. That's also because that's the context in which this is used, right? Like DOI and DOC have both been widely used since early 1970s in labs,
Hmm.
but they're not
Yeah,
really something that's used recreationally. Like
No,
right,
most
right.
no,
people
they're
who
not.
aren't scientists
There's
know about them.
No, there's not a recreational value to them. Their duration is far too long, and the very few cases that you can ever find about people using them is really largely characterized by discomfort, GI discomfort, anxiety. There's a whole
insomnia for
yeah, they
47 hours.
they last 24 to 36 hours, so it's not an attractive compound to take, but that's also one of the reasons because it lasts so long, or its affinity, so how tightly it interacts with the serotonin 2 receptors, that relates to how long it acts for. And because it has that really long action, that's what one of the things that makes it such an ideal tool compound.
Yeah, and I just want to add too, like the importance of it as this tool and why we're all able to like spout these facts about these substances to you guys is because they've been a lot around for so long. They've been unscheduled. They've been available for characterization and research. DOI can be not only used as like a pharmacological tool to do like dose responses to look at brain signaling, but it can also be used as a tool to measure like the amount of receptors in the brain through like these things that we call binding assays, but it's basically just like you can label DOI specifically so that it labels the different areas in your brain. So that is really, really cool to use in cells and to use in these models because it really just gives us such a good idea of serotonin receptors and of how just like the just the receptor pharmacology in general. So, and that's
I'm
only possible because we have them
I'm going to ask
available.
you guys to dumb it down even more. Like, why do we
Yeah, can I
care?
I was
Why do
gonna
Okay.
we care
summarize.
about the serotonin receptors? Like, why does that
Yeah,
matter?
please, Joe, summarize.
Yeah. So I was going to summarize just some points that we've made so far. So DOI especially, much more so than DOC, has been around for a while. It has certain properties, pharmacological properties that make it really, really useful for studying serotonin receptors. And that's where psychedelics primarily act. And so it's a really good compound for studying receptors related to psychedelic action. And we know that those are being used for to treat a wide variety of mental health conditions. And people have published extensively with this compound. So DOI, I think Kat said at the beginning, has been published like 900 plus times since the 70s and 80s. And because it's so well characterized, it's a really, really useful compound and a good compound to use in scientific research because we can know exactly what doses to use, exactly, how it behaves in animals, etc. So it's a really, really essential tool to psychedelic research, and having this put into Schedule 1 would be a huge loss for the psychedelic scientific community.
What kind of, yeah, so let's what kind of research is this going into? What are the ways that this could help people? Because it seems to me like this actually goes beyond just psychedelics, right? It's just
Totally.
larger public health.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's used. Um, so, as we've said a couple times, it's super specific to serotonin receptors, and you can use, and as Alaina said, you can use it to label where all of those are in the brain. So, basically, you could take a picture of where all of these proteins are all over the brain, and the time-old adage of form follows function. So, if we understand where it is, it can help us discern what is this target's involvement. Why would it just be randomly in this location if it didn't have a reason for being there? So back in the 1980s, DOI was used to identify where all of these serotonin 2 receptors were located. They're located in like decision making areas with mood that are associated with mood regulation or learning and memory. So we really need a tool to understand how critical proteins receptors that are involved with memory and mood are regulated. But I can pass that then to Tanner.
Yeah, I think that was a great description. And I think it's important to remember in regards to how important DOI and DOC, especially DOI, are to research, is that this goes even beyond psychedelic drugs as well. A lot of people don't realize this, but so much of what we know about serotonin 2 receptors in the brain, whether that's in regard to psychedelic drugs or just serotonin at large, can be attributed to studies that were done with DOI, whether that's like the physiology of what these receptors do to neurons or where they're located. DOI has been a really important tool for that. And then in regards to psychedelic research, an even bigger chunk of that literature is built on DOI. If people in the audience don't know this, I mean, you've heard of the recreational psychedelic drugs and they're used in research as well, but because of some of the things that we've mentioned before, they're not always as ideal for experiments as DOI is. And a lot of what we know about how psychedelics work and what they do to the brain and neurons within the brain is has been done with DOI.
Yeah, so
Yeah, and
go ahead, Elena.
oh, I just wanted to add too, because I think a lot of times we attribute serotonin just to being to like related to mood disorders or related to like cognition or stuff like that. But I also want to point out that it is like the like great neurotransmitter. It's involved in almost everything. Like it's involved in like appetite, it's involved in pain perception. There's a lot of different circuits that serotonin regulates. It's kind of like the great regulator of neurotransmitters. And so I think that's something really important to think about when we're talking about research. We're not just talking about psychedelics or mental health or stuff like that. We're also talking about things that like ail the everyday person. Like everyone's been in pain, everyone's been hungry. So like this research goes into a lot of stuff that could just really benefit people as a whole.
So this is crucial research that we're talking about. This is also foundational research. We're talking about, as we said, this is a de facto chemicals that are used for understanding how serotonin is working in our brain. It applies to just a whole wide swath of different things that ail the average person that we could be helping them on. And the DEA is trying to outlaw them. So tell me about that. Let's go back to the case and what's actually happening here.
Yeah,
Take me back to 2022. What happened?
yeah. So there was the UN had the United Nations had voted to place an analog, DOC, which has a chlorine where at the I think it's the 4 position of the compound, and that just relates to how things are numbered. But they wanted to put one of the analogs in controlled sub or in the single convention on narcotics, and that automatically triggers the DEA.
So I'm going to take
Yeah,
a step back for folks. So
sure,
this is
sure.
basically like, for folks who are familiar with U.S. drug policy, we have the Controlled Substances Act that everything's scheduled under. This is the international version of that we're talking about.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. So, um, the DA is obliged by an international, or the U.S. is obliged by international treaties to put one of these on the Controlled Substances Act, but DOI not so much. They did this because they believe that these two compounds are so similar. They are analogs of one another, but that doesn't mean that they're the same. Tiny variations in chemical structure can cause a huge bit of difference in the pharmacology, and that's a really exciting part about chemistry. Um, yeah.
But tell me about the case itself. Like what happened? So the DEA
Oh, yeah.
in 2022 says that they're going to put DOI and DOC on Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act. So first off, what does Schedule 1 mean? What does that mean to folks? What is that going to do?
Yeah, so Schedule 1 compounds are drugs that have no medical value and highly abusable in the eyes of the DA. That would be heroin, that would be LSD, marijuana. There's a number of compounds there. Uh, and so if a drug is Schedule 1, they are very difficult to work with. There's a huge amount of paperwork. It's a long time to even get approved when you're in a lab to work on it. And this is because the DA says these things are really dangerous to society, so we need to limit access to them incredibly. And SSDP filed in May or April of 2022 to prevent the DEA from putting DOI and DOC in Schedule 1 because we said, well, if you put these compounds in the Controlled Substances Act, you essentially make serotonin receptor research illegal. You're putting such huge blockades in front of it that people aren't going to jump into it. And as has been mentioned before, they're used because for a couple of reasons, but they're not scheduled. And so that allows people from all sorts of different scientific topics to jump in and start asking important questions. And when you have people from different fields working on a new area, they bring different ideas. And that helps us ask all sorts of really interesting new questions that if you've been in a field for, let's say, 30 years, you might just say, that's probably not going to work. So you need something accessible. And let's say cardiac pharmacologists or microbiologists, they don't have to jump through the same kinds of hurdles that a neuroscience researcher does. And scientists aren't really just choosing to work on a topic because, they like psychedelics. They're really hard to work on. The brain is incredibly complicated, but they're usually interested in how parts of the brain might work or a protein. They're not just choosing to work on one drug. So putting it on Schedule 1 would have essentially made psychedelic research pretty much illegal, so to speak. Put these massive walls around it. So we filed. There were some rounds of back and forth with the government, and eventually the case was dropped in August of 2022. And then
Victory, but not for
yeah,
long.
yep. And so then in December of 2023, just about a week before Christmas, they put on the Federal Register, hey, we're going to put this, we want to schedule this again. Um, and so luckily I
Right.
got in
And I
contact.
feel like if we didn't have these I'm sorry guys, you guys are nerds. Uh we all are, right? Like drug policy nerds who are also watching what's happening with DOI and DOC, maybe we wouldn't have noticed it, especially the week before Christmas.
Right.
Eli
Yeah.
literally texted me and was like, "Guess what?"
Like 8 a.m. or 7:30 in the morning. Yeah. I
Because
should,
Yeah, and I
everyone
was
reads
home
the
for
Federal
Christmas.
Register while they're just relaxing during the holidays, right?
yeah.
Right. Like I'm home for Christmas and it's like 8 a.m., which everyone who knows me knows not to text me before 8 a.m. Eli didn't know yet, but yeah, it was funny. So I woke up to that and I was like, great, let's get to work.
Yeah. So then we started putting feelers out in the psychedelic research community asking who wants to work on this. I mean, this is if it's scheduled, again, psychedelic research is gonna or serotonin receptor research is gonna be walled off. Who wants to work on this? And so I linked up with Joe and Tanner and a few other folks, and we filed this request for a hearing. And that was filed in early January and off to the races.
Well, and then what ended up happening is we weren't the only ones to file, right? There were a couple other folks, including Robert Rush, who was representing Dr. Raul Ramos, who will be one of the witnesses as well, and I think might actually be listening right now. And we teamed up with them as well.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, we thought
Yeah.
it would be smart to team up with them because he's another scientist, and it would just be a wise use of our time to combine efforts on that. So we filed a whole bunch of rounds of paperwork with the DEA. The DEA has tried to limit what the witnesses can discuss,
Totally.
and have called into question their relevancy to the case, even though they work on it, and have had to tried to toss two of the world's foremost experts on psychedelics, Dr. David Nutt and Dr. David Nichols as well, and calling them essentially irrelevant to the case.
Yeah, even though forgive me, but I think is it Dr. Nichols who's published over 800 articles on DOI?
It's several hundred, and he invented the radioligand, so the version of the compound used to label all the receptors in the brain. Yeah, he's
Yep.
one of the foremost experts on the planet about these compounds.
And Dr. David Nutt was a former drug czar in the United Kingdom. So, and he's written several books and articles about drug policy.
Yeah, so let's talk about this, right? So it really feels to me like this whole thing is almost an effort to push medical science back into the dark ages because, we talked about how DOI and DOC really could be the key to understanding so much about how our brain works, and how we can treat things that are really, I think, quite crucial for us to better understand, such as pain and substance abuse disorder and just such a wide swath of things that impact so many of us. So we've talked about how scheduling would essentially shut down this research, and then we look at the approach that the DEA has taken with this, where a lot of folks simply don't know what DOI and DOC are. And we've seen research even as we've been working on this case, we've seen new research coming out. It's quite possible that a lot of the researchers doing this have no idea that their research is about to be criminalized, put to an end, and they're not going to be able to move forward on it. And even in our back and forth with the court, the DEA did try to essentially say that no one that we couldn't have all of you all. We had, I think, Elijah had originally gotten together 22 people in the SSDP Science Policy Committee who had done research on DOI and DOC, and I think now we have a slightly
There's
smaller number.
yeah,
There's
15 folks.
15 who are going to be testifying, and they tried to shut down that conversation. And more importantly, they also tried to suggest that we couldn't even talk about the harm to research that would come about. And so that's one of the great wins. One of the great wins of this case so far is that I think this might potentially be one of the first times that research harm is going to be discussed when it comes to a scheduling decision, right? Because there is massive harm that would come about to simply research. This is just the ability to learn new things about the way that our brains work, the way that our bodies work, and how we can better treat people who are in pain, who are suffering, who whether it's physical pain, psychological pain, and yeah, I mean that's fascinating to me. And at times it's almost at cross purposes. Tanner, your research, I mean, you have multiple studies that you've been working on using a DOI, I think just DOI or DOC as well, and these are government funded studies. You have NIDA grants to do this, and your work would be completely shut down by this. Am I wrong?
Yeah, no, you're totally right. It would be devastating for me and lots of other researchers like me. And you're also right about the funding part. I specifically have a training grant for PhD candidates called an F-31 that I got from NIDA to study DOI for its therapeutic potential and for its effects to discover how serotonin works in a unique part of the brain I'm interested in. And then now another government agency is going to try to schedule that. That could be devastating for my research. And many others out there, researchers that don't have their Schedule 1 licenses. And just to give an idea of like how much of a pain in the butt it is to get these Schedule 1 licenses, I work in a lab with the PI who's very well established in the field of substance use disorder. He's a cocaine researcher, and he has been for like 15 years now, at least. And he's got a Schedule 2 license. He has many
So
papers
let
out.
me pause this for folks because
Yeah,
I think some people may not know this. So cocaine is actually Schedule 2
yeah.
on the Controlled Substances Act, the Federal Controlled Substances Act, because there are some accepted medical uses. And of course, you know, this is an ongoing conversation, marijuana at Schedule 1, and there's certainly we have medical marijuana because there are what one would say are accepted medical uses. DOI and DOC are being used pretty much exclusively for medical research, right? Is that a medical use? Please continue.
Yeah, they're used for medical research, and hopefully these drugs are similar ones. It could end up being really effective in the clinic as well, and that's kind of the idea. But yeah, like I was saying, we had this well-established lab with many papers out on using drugs that are scheduled, and it still took us like over a year to just recently kind of get towards the end of getting the Schedule 1 license. And it's a lot of time and money, and you have to be at a large research institution that can do this. It took a long time, so it's not easy to acquire a Schedule 1 license. It's not as simple as okay, the drug you've been researching for 5 years is now Schedule 1. That's okay. You can just get a Schedule 1 license. Like this would have completely halted my PhD candidacy.
Right. And so
Yeah.
what happens? Let's actually talk about that. What happens to someone who's a PhD candidate or a postdoc who is doing research, who, like you, might actually have government funding specifically to do research using DOI or DOC? What happens if DOI or DOC get moved to Schedule 1? To you personally, what would happen to you and your research? I mean, obviously you're doing a lot of really interesting stuff. With brain mapping and things like that, but how would it impact your career?
Yeah, I mean, it would have been, it'd be bad. I'd have to stop using DOI in the lab. And, luckily I'm at the end of my PhD. I've got a few months left. So if it does get put in Schedule 1, I've completed enough of my PhD where, I could still wrap things up maybe, but like a lot of the cherry on top experiments I have planned, I totally would just have to nix those. Or if reviewers from journals were like, hey, for this one experiment, we'd like you to repeat this experiment doing this instead or something. And I have to say, sorry, I can't. My drug is banned now. I can't do this anymore. And if this would happen to many of the researchers out there who are not at the end of their PhD, who are maybe in their third or fourth years where they've dedicated all of this time, but they're not close to finishing yet exactly. Like they would have to, I don't know, pivot your project into study something different, or it could be really bad for a lot of the researchers out there that study DOI and
Right.
that have
Yeah,
wasted
just
Almost
years of
to,
work on it.
to make this
just
a cheap, a really simple analogy, it's almost like you go to school to get your undergraduate degree in Spanish, and then they get rid of that department, so now you have a French diploma, right? Like, what
Yeah,
would
it
you
would
do with
literally
that?
be like that, but you'd have to like start over too. Like if they banned the drugs I use for this research I'm interested in, then like okay, I guess I could get my PhD in like a different project studying like dopamine or something, but that's like another 5 years of work, you know? It
Hmm.
could have been bad.
Joe, I didn't mean to cut you
yeah.
off before.
No, I was just gonna say on that same topic. I'm in medical school right now, gonna start graduate school in January, and I'm making plans with the PI to use DOI and a lot of our
You
pilot
guys have used that term
experiment.
a couple times. What's a PI?
Principal investigator, the head of a lab, the person who directs a research lab. Um, but yeah, so we're planning experiments and projects for my PhD work, and DOI was going to be critical to a lot of the experiments that we want to run. And he only has a Schedule 2 license. He doesn't have a Schedule 1 license. So, in very real terms, that could put off the start of the work that I want to do in my PhD by a year or more.
Right, because you also would have to get the funding. A lot of smaller labs don't have the ability to get this license. And then even if you do have the incredible amount of money, there's a lot of red tape, there's a lot of long waits. Well, and let's also talk about what happens with there's the other possibility as well. Wouldn't there be just less access to DOI and DOC if it was Schedule 1? It would be harder to, even if you did get that Schedule 1 license, wouldn't it be harder to just get access to it to be able to use it in your research?
Yeah, so I think it's important to note here, like each institution and each state has its own like part of the license as well. So not only do you have to go through the federal licensure, which can take 4 to 6 weeks for to even get your application looked at, you also have to go through your university, your institution, and your state, and that's more paperwork. Um, and then if say it is end up being scheduled, there are only certain manufacturers that will be approved to produce the substance, and then there will be a quota of specific amount of the substance that each lab can obtain based on their license and their institution and just the rules of the controlled substances license. So there's a lot that goes into that, including
A lot of
that
hoops.
situation.
That's a lot of hoops. I just want to flag for everyone who's listening online, if you have questions, please start dropping them in the chat, or you can also put them in the Q&A. I see one of them coming in already. So we'll start asking that in a minute. But Alaina, I want to push you a little bit more on that. So now if there's a limited amount of DOI or DOC that your lab could get, you've got that Schedule 1 license, you've gone through all those hoops, you've cut through that red tape and incredible expense to even be able to get to this point. Does that then impact the type of research that you're going to be able to do? Just
Yeah,
simply.
so I think yeah, so it'll definitely impact it because depending on the length of your experiments or like the amount of experiments that you're running, if they're animal experiments, if they're cell, if they're, any type, you're gonna need a specific amount. And so if you and also if you just like have a large lab, multiple projects using the same drug, you have to really plan those experiments and keep up with that. And I also just wanted to add, in my experience, I've seen this happen not to my lab, but to a different one in my PhD, where they were switching over PIs, and one boss ended up leaving, and another one came in, so they were switching the name on the license. The lab had to stop all of their research and had to have people from the DEA come in and like clear out their fridge. So they had to completely stop their experiments. They had to throw away all of the drug that they already had, even though it was perfectly fine, and get new drug under the correct person's name. And so that is just something that is also to think about, that not only is this potentially causing issues with stopping or halting research, it's also wasteful.
Yeah, no, so let's talk about that, right? So like that's another halt that would happen. Like let's say that we even get to this point, you're able to get that Schedule 1 license, you're now doing this research. Someone could just change jobs, and then everybody who's in the lab who's doing this research is again throwing that away. We're putting a pause. They're going to have to get more money, more funding to be able to get more of it, restart, right? So What's the impact? What's the impact on people here? Because this seems like a big impact that people should really be worried about. Why would the average American care?
I can say like in terms of my own research, like if something were to happen when I was doing my PhD, I was researching effects of like the serotonin system on reducing opioid craving and opioid withdrawal. So that is like a very large impact given the opioid crisis that we have going on right now, and trying to just help people come up with novel treatments for their substance use. So if my research was halted, I would not have been able to find these really crucial findings of how serotonin is implicated in potentially reducing cravings of opioids in our models. So
Right, and this is something that people do care about a lot right now. The opioid crisis is very real. It's impacting a lot of people. And, the fact that the DEA is, again, at purposes with even their own stated mission, where we're talking about, okay, how do we help deal with things like the opioid crisis? And they don't want you to do the research on it. I want to go and ask a couple questions from the audience, and I want to encourage everyone else, please drop some questions in that Q&A box. I see one here from Kelly Hoffman, who is asking, do you know how many entities have a Schedule 1 license right now?
So I looked this up earlier actually because I was curious. So the most recent thing I could find on like line was that in 2017 there was about 600 individual researchers that were registered with the DEA. I know it's since then increased. I saw a talk at a conference from someone at the DEA that suggested that it's probably closer to 1,000 now, and they get new applications daily.
Right, but I mean that thousand, how many people have asked? And so I have a question for you, again, about this, okay? So like let's say that of those 600 people, are they just okay to do any Schedule 1 research, or do they have to get that license and then get each individual experiment approved, or
It's more similar to the latter. You have to like request specific drugs and like in your application you have to like have I'd argue pretty detailed explanations of like the experiments you're gonna be planning on doing and how much you need and what you're going to be using it for and whatnot. So it's not something if you get a Schedule 1 license, you can't just start working with like every Schedule 1 substance and like do whatever you want. There's a lot of like structure to it, and you have to apply for every drug that you want to use.
Right. And,
Yes, and
and
you have to.
Oh, and one of
Oh,
the
I
nice
was.
parts about science is you should be able to ask questions as they come on board. You have a really nice novel idea, you should be able to test it. And in your application for that Schedule 1 license for that drug, you have to really describe what those experiments will be. So it limits academic freedom as well.
Yeah, you have to submit a specific research proposal for and including the amounts of drug that you're planning on using, and you have a binder which you must document every time that you make the drug, and it's very, very controlled, which I guess makes sense. But
right? And
um,
you'd have to have some bureaucrat somewhere approving that you're allowed to look into the question that you have and that they think it's valuable, right?
yes, and even so with animal research, you have to submit your animal protocols to a separate entity and then get them approved there and then send it again into to get approved through the DEA, even though it's already been approved through your institution. So yeah, there's a lot of double work happening.
Thank you. I'm going to ask another question here from the audience. Jack Smith asks, do you anticipate the lawsuit being settled before the change in administration in January? And if not, will the changes affect the lawsuit in any way?
Yeah,
Um,
I can answer that. So the hearing runs from November 12th through 25th. The administrative law judge is expected to make a decision during the trial or at the end of the trial or hearing, I should say, because it's not a
I
jury
always want
trial.
to say trial
Yeah,
too.
yeah, it's an administrative hearing. This is a different type of court proceeding given under the Administrative Procedures Act.
Yeah,
Um,
it's worth noting. So we are essentially challenging the DEA within the DEA's own court
yeah.
system. It's
So
run
there's D
by the DEA.
yeah, there's DEA attorneys, and then there's a judge appointed, I believe, by the DEA administrator, who will oversee this case. Um, And so the administrator, though, does get final say over it. The administrator also serves at the pleasure of the president because they're an executive branch appointee. So I hope that answers that question. We do anticipate it to be settled before the new administration.
Now that said, this is a part of a larger fight, a larger campaign that SSDP does have to protect scientific research, research into psychedelic substances, and it will be an ongoing effort, regardless of how things go later this month. I
Yeah,
Oh no, please go ahead.
yeah, can I just add on to that a little bit? So we've made a lot of arguments so far as to what we've termed like research harm, right? But there's also the broader case that I think we're prepared to make, that these drugs don't belong in Schedule One. That psychedelics in general might not belong in Schedule One. And that's because the two criteria are that they have a high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use. And, basically up to this point, the DEA so far has just been putting anything that they want into Schedule One that doesn't have an FDA approval. And now, since we're finally fighting them on this, we can kind of make the case that through this specific argument that psychedelics don't belong in Schedule One because they don't have a high potential for abuse as we're prepared, and they're starting to have accepted medical uses as we're seeing in clinical trials. Now, what you define as accepted is a little up in the air, but I just wanted to make the point that this could actually be a really big win for broader drug policy. And people in the future might look back to this case and look back to the arguments that we're making here, to try to get wins for other drugs like psychedelics or cannabis or you name it, because this could really be a tide shift in how we think about these things.
Yeah, and I think also if we're going to look at that broader impact as well, with the striking down of Chevron deference in the two major SCOTUS decisions earlier this year too, this could also just be a new way of looking at the administrative court system overall, which is, as I said, the fact that we are essentially challenging the DEA in the DEA court. So we've got a lot of other great questions here. They're coming in. So guys, keep coming them in, keep coming in with them. There's some great ones. But we are, of course, like a grassroots network of folks all over the US who are trying to implement more sensible policies rooted in science and compassion and human rights, rather than what we think of as typical drug war policies. And so DeAndre Smith he asked, and I've lost it. There was a good one. What role does public opinion play in the outcome of scheduling decisions? And if I can start with this, I know you guys have a lot, but that's actually been a big part of what SSDP has been looking at with DOI and DOC, right? Because there's this whole legal case and this legal avenue that we've been pursuing. But another part of it is that, when we started this work back in 2022, no one knew what DOI and DOC were, and they didn't know what the impact was. And they are widely they are widely used by scientific researchers, including for medical research. We've seen more studies being published even over the course of the past year as we've been engaged in this. And yet, the average American has no idea that this is happening, and even the average person in the psychedelic community hasn't heard of DOI or DOC, and so they don't know this is happening. And the average person who's doing DOI and DOC research doesn't know that this is happening, and their entire career, all of their work could get shut down. And so that has been a huge part of this as well, is that we've really been trying to educate the public about what DOI and DOC are and why this is so crucial and so important. And as we've been talking to people, as we've been talking to the media, I think that message has really resonated. And so I think that's part of it. But I don't want to, I took the moderator's prerogative there for a minute, but I'd love to hear as well from you all about what we really think public opinion plays in terms of the outcome of the scheduling. And
Yeah.
I'd like to add to that maybe what can folks who are in support of keeping DOI and DOC legal can do.
Yeah, I mean the broad message is America has the great promise of government for the people by the people. And that's one of the reasons there is the Federal Register. So you can look up what new rules are being made and executive branch rulemaking procedures like this. The DEA is an executive branch office. Uh, they you can track those new rules and get engaged with them. So our work here has really demonstrated how students with expertise can get involved in the operations of the government and stay engaged with for the people, by the people.
Yeah, that's wonderful. What about students who aren't scientists? Is there a role for them?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I think it's generally helpful to be aware of what the government is doing. And as scientists, I really view us as public servants. We're trying to understand how biology works so we can, as pharmacologists and neuroscientists, because we want to develop therapeutics and improve public health. So, you know, talk, having people come and talk to us and engage and learn about what we're doing, I think is equally helpful because we're trying to understand all of this to help the world, really.
And I think also there's a role for like call your congressman, tell them that this is important to you.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, like on paper, like many of these hearings and rulings and decisions, it might sound like it's totally something that on paper is going to be decided by the judge in a hearing and whatnot, and that's true technically. But throughout history, there's been many different uh, progress has been made by public opinion, having heavily pressured these kinds of scenarios, but letting their voices be heard.
So let me ask a question here. I see from Chris Monaco. Does a decision stand forever after this is decided, or will this be a constant fight if the DEA changes its mind again later on?
Yeah, I can answer that. And Chris, thank you for coming. And Chris is Emory classmate. So it not necessarily is the answer. This is not the same way legally binding, but it is certainly a precedent. The only way reasonably that it would come back up should be if there was somehow a massive uptick in consumption. Let's say now tens of thousands of people are taking this every year. There's people going to the hospital, dying, where it becomes a substantial public health hazard, and no one's ever died from it ever. That again, it
Well,
lasts
not just
24.
that. We're not seeing seizures. We're not
Yeah,
seeing no one's getting
no, yeah,
arrested.
the law
Yeah.
enforcement in
Finding
the
this.
last several years, they have not encountered it, and it's not being reported to the forensic crime labs. So there's not any use of it anyways. So it wouldn't make sense for the DEA to do this action again because there's already this court precedent to not schedule it if it should go that way.
Now, it's also worth mentioning, and you brought it up earlier as well, Eli, but there's the UN scheduled DOC, not DOI. And so I think that that's another forefront. SSDP is a consultative non-government organization to the UN. So that might be another pathway that we want to take to bring these same arguments to have them remove DOC from Schedule 1. And to protect other similar substances, DOI perhaps if they wanted to move down that pathway from that happening. There's we don't just have we live in a federalist system, so it's not just the Federal Controlled Substances Act, there's state-based controlled substances acts. So that might be another venue. So certainly this effort to keep research using DOI and DOC legal doesn't end with this hearing. I see another great question here, which I know that we've discussed a lot, and it's been interesting for me to kind of hear a little bit about the work that you all do when it comes to this. But what are the current safeguards that prevent misuse of DOI and DOC in labs?
Shannon, you
So,
want to take that?
yeah, I mean, if when you work in a research lab at like a large university and whatnot, there are all sorts of training protocols we have to be certified for. and every single year we have to uh, take classes and pass exams on like proper etiquette in a lab to handle drugs and handle animals and do all of these things to follow the rules. So that the safeguards are the standard rules that we follow in research. And if you follow those, then DOI is perfectly safe to work with. There's not like extra DOI or psychedelic specific safeguards that you need to like apply for to work with DOI. But if you're working within the realms of like legitimate academic research, there's plenty of safeguards everywhere coming at us from all angles of things that we have to constantly renew and whatnot. And if you follow those, then those are the safeguards to work with it.
And I also want to note, DEA has indicated in their filing from the Federal Register that there is not diversion of DOI or DOC to the streets for the very few times that
What is that? What does that
encountered.
explain?
Yep. Yeah.
What
So,
does that help people?
yeah. So any encounters by law enforcement, and there's very few, and I'm indicating less that for DOI, there have been less encounters by the police than there are states in the US over a 20-year period. But none of it is coming from a lab like Tanner's, mine, Joseph's, or Alaina's. That's what that means. So it's not coming out of our labs. Researchers treat this very seriously.
Yeah, and when researchers use these kind of drugs in the lab, there's usually very good chains of custody. So you know how much you order, how much you get in, and you log how much you use on each experiment, and you know how much should be left over. So like it's very difficult for someone to divert from a lab that's using those good protocols. And nowadays almost all academic centers are following those very strict chain of custody bookkeeping strategies and protocols. So, like Elijah said, there's no evidence that these drugs are being diverted from laboratories. And in general, it's just sort of a hard thing to do to divert drugs from laboratories. Not to say it doesn't happen, but it's very, very rare, and most places have very good safeguards against that.
Yeah, so it's not only that there isn't demand for or interest in these drugs recreationally, there's also just it's not being diverted because there are safety protocols. And there are so many more questions coming in, and I'm so glad that there is so much interest in this. Unfortunately, we are coming up on time. So I did want to ask all of our panelists here today, in just one or two sentences, we've talked about a lot of different things here. What do you want people to take out of this discussion?
I'll start with it as the chair of the Science Policy Committee. That again, America is run. It's supposed to be run for the people, by the people. So engage in policy work. This really shows that people can be involved and get a group of folks together and work to change the way in which science is done. So people should be actively involved in the government. And we have demonstrated a clear playbook on how to do that.
I can go next. So I think my biggest thing from just an educational standpoint about these substances is that nobody's doing these substances like they're not um, abused. They are not dangerous. So I think that is something to keep in mind when we talk about this and when we talk about other psychedelics. Um, yeah, that's my thing.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I'll for sure echo what Elijah and Alaina said. These drugs do not meet the requirements that allow them to be put into Schedule 1. They're not being abused, and the no medical use for them is quickly becoming an iffy statement to make about all psychedelic drugs, because as we're seeing, there's many breakthrough successes in many psychedelic drugs, including in treating all sorts of psychiatric disease. And DOI is certainly one of them, especially in preclinical research. So I really appreciate everyone showing up and supporting us in our endeavor to battle the DEA.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a really important moment in public drug policy history. This could be a really, really big, yeah, an important hearing. So very happy that everybody's here, and also just wanted to echo what everyone else is saying, that not all drugs are the same. It's too bad that we just have one word, drug, for many different kinds of substances, and not all of them are dangerous. And I think these two compounds in particular are not dangerous at all, and do not pose a public health threat. So
Yeah,
yeah.
well, thank all of you. I think that this, these are two such important research chemicals. We've seen just incredible potential for how they could not just improve all of our lives, but also potentially save lives. And scheduling DOI and DOC is pushing research back into the dark ages. And so I think the work that all of you are doing with SSDP Science Policy Committee is just so important. And I think it also speaks to the value of young people, of students. You don't have to be you don't have to have access to the kinds of resources you would think that you would need to be able to move forward on this. You're making a real impact on the world, and you're doing it just by coming together with other people with these interests and getting involved. And so I think that that's really incredible. I want to thank all of you for that. I want to thank you for this discussion today, and for everyone who tuned in, everyone who's been getting involved and getting interested, all of the media outlets that have been covering this and helping us really get out the word about DOI and DOC. If you are in the DC area, please come join us tomorrow night for a little meet and greet happy hour we're having at the Passenger for folks to get together and kind of talk about DOI and DOC, what's coming next. And our public hearing, 10-day public hearing, does start this Tuesday at the DEA court. If you are around Arlington, Virginia, and you are interested, you can come and watch. And please stay tuned to SSDP. You can find us across social media. You can find us at ssdp.org. And there is unfortunately not a way to watch the hearing remotely. You will have to either attend in person or tune in. Just follow SSDP. We'll be giving people updates on the case. We'll be trying to get as much information out there to folks. And please get involved. You can make a change, and please support the people who are. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't ask. This is true grassroots work that's making a real big impact. So go to ssdp.org/donate and help us continue this kind of work. And so thank you all, and I'm so excited for the updates we're going to have for all of you coming soon. Let's keep psychedelic research legal.
Yes, thanks everybody.
Everybody.
Thanks all.
Thanks.